Hello and welcome to episode 21 of the Luminosity of Free Software. I apologize for it being on a really strange day and time, that being Tuesday and in the evening. Usually I do this on Thursday or Friday, but I was away for last week off with family. We were hanging out in the Alps where it's very pretty, but not so much internet. So while I had a laptop, I had no internets. So I'm trying to do 2 of these a month. So I figured I'll just do it when I get back, which landed it on a Tuesday, so that it would be twice in this month. We'll be back to a regular schedule in the second week of October from there. But this week, as usual, the 2 topics that I'll be taking on before the Q&A session were selected by people on Patreon, which we'll be getting to in a bit. But thanks to everyone who participated in the survey. It was pretty close between some of the topics, but these 2 came out ahead, which is Kdenlive, non-linear video editing, which is a mouthful to say, and free software funding. So we'll dive straight on in to the first topic, which is Kdenlive. Ooh, hit my mic. But yeah, you'll notice I'm back in my messy office again for this episode. Mostly because I was away until Sunday, and I've been busy catching up with life in general between now and then. So the little studio area I've been slowly working on wasn't up for today's show, but it will be back in 2 weeks. So anyways, enough details about the show and why it's not the way it was last time. I thought this was an interesting topic for a couple of reasons. One, editing videos is a pretty common thing for a lot of people these days, YouTube being what it is. And, well, everyone has a camera. I mean, if you go back 15 years ago, it wasn't quite such a big thing to edit your videos on your computer. These days, absolutely it is. So it's interesting from a purely usage and interest point of view, but it's also interesting, I think, because it's one of those things that used to be held against free software as a classic example of things we don't have. We don't have a non-linear video editor. You can't edit videos. If you want to edit videos, you need a Mac or maybe a Windows machine. This used to be one of the really common gaps that was thrown out. And the argument against free software in terms of software gaps is relatively weak, because over time they get filled. And the more of those gaps that have been filled, the more users have come, the more interest there's been, the more gaps have filled as it goes along. We've seen this right across the board, from embedded to server software to even desktop software, which is what we're going to be looking at tonight, which is a piece of desktop software, obviously. So the Kdenlive team it's built on top of KD libraries, as the name kind of hints at. But until recently, they weren't. They're hosting outside of the KD community's infrastructure, which is fine. It's obviously completely cool to use the libraries and host your application elsewhere. But they made the decision recently to start to move over to the greater KD community's infrastructure, so that it will be on KD.org and use facilities, because it brings more energy and more of a central location for desktop free software, which is really quite good, without having to go to a GitHub or whatnot, which isn't run on purely free software. So at this meeting, when they came, they also had a meeting this year in the Alps here in Switzerland at the Randa, the infamous and legendary Randa. It really seemed to reinvigorate the team. There was a handful of people that came out, and it seems like they really set themselves a good roadmap. And they did a bunch of refactoring the other year, really improved stability in this time as well. But there's a lot of refactoring that's needs to be done to be able to allow them to move it even further from where they are right now. So that's, of course, the big question. Where are they right now? So I thought we'd just take a really quick look at the interface and what you can do with it. I'm just going to throw up the screen sharing here. Let's see. There it is, screen share. And there's my window. Okie dokie. So you should see, great. So you should now be seeing my Kdenlive running here on my laptop. It's a fairly complex interface, and there's a few rendering glitches. That's because I'm running it on a high DPI screen, and yeah, it's one of those things that trips up people when they do custom widgets and such, if they don't really think about font sizing. Generally, if you have a non-high DPI screen, it looks a little bit nicer, but it's still a fairly complex interface. So I just downloaded a couple of videos from the internet, or from YouTube, to show what you can do. So there's actually two of the ones that came up when I searched for KT Plasma. Why? Because I could. So you can see down here, these are actually the tracks. It shows 3 video tracks and 2 audio tracks. You can have more, of course, but this is usually enough, I find. So what I did is I added clips. You can add clips by right-clicking, and you hit Add Clip in the project tree area here. And to add a video, you simply drag it from the list down into one of the tracks. And once you've got in a track, you can move it back and forth. You can shorten it up by just dragging on one edge or another, and that actually changes its start position within the video clip. So you can alter both where it starts in the end video. You can also change which parts of the video you show. This is really handy for when you've got one, I find anyways, one longer take and you want to snip something out of the middle. What you can do is just shorten, say, okay, I'm just going to take the first however many seconds of video here. And then you can redrag it down to another track or the same track even. Does nice little snap to adjustments, so that it's really easy to line things up there. And then you can just go back again and say, okay, I'm going to shorten this up again to whatever. I'm just clicking and dragging. It's really that simple. Let's shorten this top one up here. Okay. And you can see now it changed over here what it's showing, because I've got it set to this point in the video. So you can just drag that point in the video around, and it'll actually show you what it would show at that point. So you have a live preview of what you've got going on. So just punk that. Now, in these ones, the video and audio are together, and maybe you don't want that, and that's easy enough to fix. You can just right-click on one of the things, do split audio, and you'll actually drop the audio down into one of the audio tracks. So of course, you can add your own audio, music, whatnot. Once you've got everything arranged the way you want it, you simply tell it to render. You can save the project, which allows you to then come back and put things back in different orders again, adjust the timing, etc. And then once you hit render, it actually writes out a file of your desired resolution with all of the audio and video rendered down into one. Really easy to use, really handy. It also has a ton of effects, everything from being able to mess with the alpha channel, so you can do blue screening or green screening, if you will. So if you have a blue screen behind you, you can make that transparent, and so you can have your video with the blue behind it in track 1, and then have your background in track 2. And your backgrounds, of course, can be just static images, don't have to be anything special. Quite a bit of audio effects. You can fade things in and out. You can fade in from black, fade out to black, distort, enhance, various things. It also integrates with a bunch of great tools. So for the actual video stuff, it uses MLT and FFmpeg. So these are two well-known, very solid tools to do video editing. And you can do a lot of these things from the command line if you're a command line genius and have lots of patience. Whereas Kdenlive just gives you this really nice project-oriented view over your entire project. So when you create a, going back to effects really quick, when you create or use an effect, you can just add it. You'll get an effect stack or a transition with it. Let's see. Let's do a. Where's one of the audio ones here? Wait. Yeah, so we can do an audio level. And it shows up here in your effect stack, and you can change the order of effects. You can configure effects when they appear. You can actually drag them around down in the timeline as well. So really simple to use, really quite cool application. Kdenlive, I'll put a link to their website in the notes on the video on YouTube later, but it's kdenlive.org, really hard to remember, obviously. But yeah, check it out if you're looking for nonlinear video editor, if you want to throw something up on YouTube and you're using free software, as one hopes. This is definitely the tool to take a look at. So what I think, again, as I said at the beginning, this is one of the areas that people said, well, free software doesn't have this, and that's why I don't use it. And so one of the things I often ask is, well, when we do fill in these gaps, we stop hearing the, complaints and moaning, but do we remember the progress we've made? And sometimes people, kind of take a dim view on free software, especially on the desktop, and go, it doesn't progress, it doesn't progress. And yet if we're actually really quite honest with ourselves, we look around at what has been done, progress is evident. You just need to look at more than the last 3 months, perhaps, to get a proper sense of time. Obviously, making something like Kdenlive here does not happen overnight. So there's been a lot of effort and work put into it. And as I said at the beginning, they had a meeting recently. The team seems to be full of energy. If you're looking for a cool project to get involved in, I'm sure they appreciate you actually got a page on their website that every free software project should have, I think, that says how you can contribute. And there's all kinds of ways, such as creating effects, doing project presets. They have quite a few project presets you can go through, frame rates and formats you can pick, and resolutions and what have you. They also have backdrops and different art things that you can put in, you can contribute or work on. There's documentation that needs to be improved on, always can be improved on, and written. All sorts of ways to participate and get involved. So there you go. There's my pitch for the Kdenlive people. It's actually something that I use myself when I do videos. So there we go. Before we go further, I'm going to throw up the have here of let's see, let me do screen sharing again. Who this week's show. I'm not doing it as an overlay because for whatever reason Google Hangouts overlay sucks, and it's completely distorted and cut off the top end of the image. Oh, let me hit the present. There we go. Now you can see it. These are the grand group of people who have become a patron of the show on patreon.com. If you go to patreon.com/LOFS for Luminosity of free software, you too can participate, and it shows your support, and you also get to vote on the topics that happen every week. And if you donate at the $3 or more per episode, you get your name here. If you wish, you can of course opt out. There's some other cool things that happen there. So speaking of how crappy the overlay is, so I had actually used screen sharing to show this image in a cute little Gwenview window. I've actually been slowly working on an FFmpeg-based system to be able to do streamcasting without having to use Google Plus Hangouts. There's a few features I need to still work on, but I've got the basic casting working. But yes, I want to have a few other things there, such as being able to have guests and whatnot. And of course, that'll be released as what I do come up with, assuming it's worth using, will be released as free software. But eventually, we'll be able to get rid of Google Plus, and I'll be able to streamcast out directly, both to YouTube, but also through other reflectors. So that's pretty cool. And that is being made in, or aided quite a bit in part by the people who are participating as patrons. So once again, thank you to all of you. And if you haven't become a patron and you like the show, please stop by and join up. So the philosophical or the community topic for this week's show is free software funding. And this is a perennial issue. Now, not all free software projects need to be funded. A lot of them are spare time projects. Some of the spare time projects going to be extremely successful. Some of them, not everyone wants funding in free software, but once you hit a certain scale, a certain size, it can really help. There are some things, some kinds of features, some kinds of bug fixing, some kinds of maintenance. Being able to host the infrastructure if you have a very popular project, to support it well can be difficult without funding. Being able to bring your developers together to meet, if you have quite a few of them scattered around the world, that also takes money. So funding often is something that larger free software projects in particular look for. But even smaller ones, some of the 1 and 2 person projects out there, they look for funding opportunities, which allows the developer to maybe spend 3-4 months that they would take off from the sabbatical from what else they are doing, and just focus and concentrate on the software. There are funding opportunities like Google Summer of Code out there, but that's more about internship, and you don't really get a whole lot out of internship other than potential new contributors. So over the long term it works, but it's not a funding source per se. So I thought we'd take a look at some of the funding sources and what the strengths and weaknesses of each are, in my opinion. And I'm sure there'll be people out there that differ with me on some of these points, in which case please leave a comment and we can discuss it, or maybe in the IRC channel as well. So what can a free software project do to fund itself, to get some funding? This isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. There isn't one. So I listed a couple of different, when I was going through and writing down my notes for the show, a few different options out there. There's obviously philanthropy and donations, people just being kind and handing out money. Obviously, if this is a great way to do things, then beggars would be millionaires, and we see them on the street. They're probably not. So to do a really good job of a donation-based system, it takes some fairly sophisticated machinery. Often this itself costs money. This is more the traditional, kind of World Wildlife Foundation style, or NPR or PBS for those in North America. Those stations on TV and radio. Their kind of funding. That's not typically easy to do, but a lot of free software projects do take donations, and some of them make several thousand a year through this, which is fantastic. There's been a recent birth, and recent is like a few years now, of crowdfunding. And crowdfunding is another form of donation and philanthropy, but more of a I give you something for something that I expect back. So the downside to crowdfunding, besides they take 8 to 10% of what is actually given, the little more difficult challenges it poses is that to do crowdfunding, you need kind of a project. And so you say, well, we're going to add this feature. And a lot of the projects that are more sexy aren't the ones that are often really needed, which are things like bug fixing and stability, things that would really benefit from having additional funding put into it, but maybe are harder to get people to care about enough to part with money. It's much easier to say, oh, we're going to make a shiny game, or we're going to take our drawing app and give it a cool OpenGL canvas. These things are often easier to get people excited about. So there's that issue. The other issue is saturation. When every free software project starts doing this all the time, the audience that is interested in both those projects as well as crowdfunding gets split. There's only so many dollars to go around. So right now, I think we've seen some really successful crowdfunded projects for free software, which is great. But that's, in my opinion, probably a lot to do with the fact that it's early days. And so the pool of money that's out there hasn't been divided into too many small pieces. But we've also seen quite a number of haven't met their goals crowdfunding projects out there for free software. So it doesn't always work. So again, this is probably not something you could count on perennially unless you do an annual event via crowdfunding, in which case you're kind of back to the traditional donation and philanthropy call. But it can work to an extent. It's not that it does not work at all. It's fairly intermittent, fairly small numbers usually. So that brings us to the next, which is a little more reliable and usually bigger pieces, and that's corporate sponsorship. So companies that sponsor, and this is where they just give money almost philanthropically, but they don't usually say, well, we're going to give you money for, X amount of money for development Y. They just say, here's some money because you believe in what you're doing. You often get bigger chunks of this. Some of the larger projects make hundreds of thousands to probably to low millions doing this. And which companies are interested in what they're doing. Unfortunately, this is often very fickle, and it's often very sensitive to changes in the economy. So when there's economic downturns, which we've had recently, this can often dry up for a project, and that can create anyways a cash flow issue. Also, each project tends to have a small number of companies that will actually be interested in putting out a certain amount of money to sponsor, which means you have a very small audience, and that increases the risk as well. If one of the audience loses interest, that's a huge percentage of your pie that just flies out the window with them. But it is typically, for the larger projects, an even better source of income in terms of stability and just pure numbers, the size of the money that comes in, than philanthropic donations. It's harder for smaller projects to do this usually, but it also can work. So then there's paid positions at companies that have an interest in, probably been the most successful way of driving funding into free software. These are the giants like Google, of free software developers to work on free software technology. And they do so not out of the kindness of their own heart per se, but because they rely on these technologies and want to see them progress. This tends to be very stable employment-wise. And because you're essentially paying an entire person, this is a good chunk of money per developer. And that adds up really, really quickly. And it's not just the giants either. There's smaller companies, thousands of smaller companies, in fact, that pay for a part of or an entire body to work on free software. So this has been very successful, it's actually been better than steady. It's grown leaps and bounds in the last 20 years, and even in the last 5, the number of positions that are out there for free software developers. As I think, was it Greg Coe-Hartman that said, if you're a free software developer, would like to get paid for free software development, and you aren't, you're doing something wrong. You might be a little bit optimistic there, but in the last few years, it's really gotten that way if you have appropriate skills or relevant skills. So this is really great. The downside of it is that once you're employed by a company to work on free software, you really end up doing what's in their interest. Very few companies will say, here, you work for us, you work on whatever free software you want. Usually it's you're working on this free software, but they often find people that want to work on that thing. So when Facebook works on PHP stuff, for instance, it's usually because the people they've hired are often people interested in that, to just pick a random example. But you don't often get to pick just blue sky, we're going to work on feature X or stability Y within the project. Often the company will say, well, this is what's important to us, this is what we need to work on, which is great. I mean, that's just a corporate version of scratching your itch, and that's not wrong, but it can lead to drift in what the project's targets are and what they're actually doing, and it may the development may too much go into the direction of what the companies who are paying the developers want, and not so much what everyone else wants. So they win, maybe the project itself doesn't in the long run. One of the other risks, and this is easily mitigated though, is if you have too many developers hired by one company, not only can then the scope really drift and take off in a wrong direction, but if that one company has problems or falters or even fails, then your development team suddenly ends up with happened in the past to some some free software teams. I really recommend that if you, as running a project, are looking at this angle, to make sure that you get people in different companies and not just one. Which brings us to the last, and probably not the only, but the last one we're going to take a quick look at, which is companies that are focused on the product. So this is more entrepreneurial. It's great thing, Kdenlive, for instance. We're going to create Kdenlive Inc. and we're going to, see if we can find customers. This is, I think, one of the more exciting ways to do it. Again, things can get lost in the mission of the company, and where the people get more focused on the company's needs and keeping the company alive necessarily than the free software project. And it requires a steady flow of customers, which when Nokia left the scene and to enter the warm embrace, or the cold embrace, if you will, of Microsoft, there were companies that really found that suddenly difficult, because they had one or maybe two clients, of which Nokia was one of them. And so you really need to have a larger steady flow of customers, otherwise you're right back to the single company problem I discussed earlier. So there's no one size fits all answer. Not all free software projects are going to be donation generators. Not all of them are going to be able to have a company set up around them. But there's a lot of ways to generate money. And the interesting thing about this is, I was at a coffee shop today, ended up chatting to the fellow next to me. He asked what I did. I told him, and the first thing he said was, "How do you make money?" So I kind of went through all of these things with him as well, and remind him that we have Red Hat's doing over $1 billion a year in revenue, and the Googles and the and even the Oracles with MySQL, but also the thousands upon thousands of entrepreneurial companies out there, as well as the purely donation-driven communities. So there we go. There's my thoughts on funding. What are the possibilities? What are the options? Some of the downsides, some of the upsides. And I've actually, in my time in free software, experienced all of these, including all the upsides and all the negatives. So this is really not so much imagination on my part as just thinking back upon and reflecting upon the last 15 years of what I've been doing. So for the last 5 minutes, we're going to quickly take a look at a question that I pulled along with me, which is about the recent bugs, the Heartbleed and shell shock bugs, which have awesome names. The security people have finally discovered marketing, it seems. So the question is, well, is free software really secure? Because here's all these bugs, like serious bugs that are popping up. So I think one of the really important things to remember is that the free software that's had these bugs is old. It's not new. These are long-standing bugs, and they're projects that didn't have as much participation as they probably should have, given how important they were. This is not an excuse, it's just the way it is. So projects that are more active, projects that actually has peer review in place and has, does security checking and security auditing, these things, they tend to fare better. I think that's why we're seeing bugs, these kind of bugs, not coming out of more of the modern software that is also widely used, but some of the older software that people are finally taking a look at to see, well, okay, well, what else can we break? The really important thing is that people can find these bugs and these problems, and they can break them, which means that they can be fixed as well. And so the shell shock bug, which affected Bash and affected just all kinds of operating systems out there in fairly significant ways, was fixed quite quickly, multiple times actually. They had to take a few runs at it. They've kept finding new ways to exploit it. So I've actually had it updated twice on my system in the last 2 days, I think, source of the problem. But people were able to fix it, be able to identify the problem, address it, fix it quickly. When the bug was announced, along with the initial fixes, hacker or black hats, I will call them, I shouldn't call them hackers. It's not quite a good way of describing it, but I hate the term cyber criminals as well, but the miscreants of the world released malware that takes advantage of it. But the patches were already there, and things can get patched very quickly, which it just underlines the importance of a good patch regimen for all of your machines and systems. But more importantly, it means that this was probably found by the good guys before at least most of the bad guys, and it was able to be fixed not by necessarily the people who wrote it, but the people who found it. And the people who relied on it. And this is the difference between free software and proprietary software. The bugs in proprietary software, we know to go discovered, and when we security research poking their way at these black boxes, they often are just sat on by the companies